Now, our first speaker this morning is presenting live from Toronto, where it's roughly 8:30 p.m. last night for us. We hope she'll be able to join us in Melbourne in 2022. Dr. Carol Campbell is the Associate Professor of Leadership and Educational Change at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. She's a member of the International Council of Education Advisors for the Scottish Government and a member of the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement. Originally from Scotland, Carol has held education, academic and government roles in Canada, the United Kingdom and the United States of America. Please welcome Carol Campbell.
Thank you, Jacinta. It's my absolute pleasure to join you all today, and thank you for that warm welcome. As Jacinta mentioned, I'm joining you from Toronto on Thursday evening, but I'm very happy to be here with you. And if we begin my slides, I'm going to take you through a presentation for the next 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will have a period of time for some questions. And for those of you who are social media users, I am active on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter at CarolCampbell4, and I will certainly respond to any comments or questions that you may have as we go through today's presentation and conversation. Can we get the next slide, please? So can somebody help me see my slides, please? Thank you. So it's my pleasure to join you on what is World Teachers' Day in Australia. And of course, as you've heard from the introductions today, it's a particularly unusual year, a year in which working as an educator in the education system has been challenging, and it's a year when in the UNESCO phrase they've looked at how as teachers and World Teachers' Day we celebrate the successes but also the challenge of this year in a remote learning world, and now as you move forward in COVID times, and that will certainly be part of my conversation today. Unfortunately, I'm joining you from Toronto, whereas I had hoped to be with you in person, and I hope that I will be able to take up Jacinta's kind offer to join with you in 2022. It would be my absolute pleasure to come and be with you in Australia. And today, as we go through the conversation about school improvement in the COVID world, the one thing that I really want to say to you is that you matter. The work that you do as educators matters very much. And I want to say to you that you matter at all times. Education matters, but perhaps in this time of a global pandemic, you matter even more so than before. And I can say that to you as someone who comes from a family that believes strongly in the importance of education. Indeed, my mother was a teacher, and I was brought up to believe in the absolute power of education and its importance. And my own career has been in education for over 27 years now in a range of roles. So You matter, and I want to say thank you to you on World Teachers' Day. Now, I want to talk to you about the importance of the education profession. And I told you about my own values and the importance of education to me. But this isn't just a statement of what I think, it's actually an evidence-based fact. We now have a large body of evidence that indicates the importance of the education profession for our schools and for our students, and of course for wider society. If we could move on a couple more slides. So this was me doing my attempt at a joke about being on video, but at that point I couldn't see myself or my slides, so I guess, anyway, we kept going. And if we can go on one more, please. And the point I was making about you matter, and one more, please. And one more, please. And this is the study that I was talking about constructing teachers' professional identity. And if we go to the next slide, this diagram shows about the shift to where high-performing education systems tend also to be those ones that have invested in the teaching profession. So how do we bring together the investment in students and school improvement with investment and support in the education profession? You need both. It's not an either or. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what are some of the policies that support the education profession? Well, the first one is, of course, thinking about career paths. Is it attractive to go into education? Is it attractive to stay in education? Thinking about what's the policy context, to what extent is it supportive or not of education, or supportive or not of the education profession and the people that work in education? And are there actual policies around the status of the profession? Policies to ensure that teaching is considered to be highly regarded, and that is a political message and a public message, as well as an educational message. It's really important. Respect matters. Respect is hard earned, but it matters, and it matters for the education profession. Thinking about work-life balance, and that is certainly a challenge. It has been for a long time, but especially in these COVID times. And then as we think about student outcomes and school improvement, how do we also think about the role of teachers and school leaders and support staff in that combination? If we go to my next slide, please. So there's increasing attention to what's called the teacher-led education system. This is a phrase that's now being used by the OECD and other international organisations. And when I'm talking about teacher leadership, I don't exclusively mean teachers. I mean the people who are working in education. How is it possible to ensure that the people who work in education have influence over decisions, are able to provide their professional judgment and expertise to inform improvement? And back to that piece about trust and respect and the values we hold for each other. And critical to all of this is actually professional development and learning. The idea of the learning profession, that the adults that work in education are lifelong learners, as well as encouraging the learning of students. And I will talk more about that in a few minutes. So next slide, please. So I've said about the importance of the education profession. I've spoken about some of the elements connected to the status of the profession, some of the policy conditions, teacher leadership, trust, and professional learning. So I want to briefly mention the Empowered Educators study. And this study did include Australia as a case study, led by Anne McIntyre and Linda Darling-Hammond, and I led on the Canada part of the study. So if we go to the next slide, please. And what I want to say here is that while I've emphasised the teaching profession, that remains important. So thinking about the dimensions of how we encourage and attract people to enter into teaching, initial teacher education preparation, the use of induction and mentoring, especially at the early career stages, but also throughout mentoring at each stage in a transition, whether into a new role, whether into a promoted position, whether into formal leadership positions, ongoing professional learning, as I've mentioned, the use of appraisal and feedback to encourage personal growth and reflection on goals and key areas for improvement, as well as areas of strength. Formal leadership opportunities, which of course is one of the areas that there's been considerable work done in Australia around the leadership trajectory into formal roles. However, when we think about high quality teaching as well as the people, this is also affected by curriculum and assessment, policies and structures and requirements and expectations, and also about ensuring that there's adequate and equitable funding for schools, which again, with Gonski and other developments in Australia has been a big aspect. So how do we support the profession both through resourcing, but also through the curriculum and assessment context that you're working in? Next slide, please. So, much of what I've said still holds true. The education profession is still absolutely vital. The policy context still matters. Curriculum and assessment still matter. Funding absolutely matters. But of course, the world's changed this year. The world changed in a way that I certainly did not anticipate when we rang in New Year 2020. And so I'm going to turn to how the world has changed this year in terms of education. And if we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. March the 11th. What were you doing on March the 11th? I certainly remember that day vividly. I had returned from traveling and there was all this talk about this virus and travelers, and I was one of them. So I myself have gone through that process of quarantine. And of course, as that day evolved on March the 11th, the World Health Organization called that this was a global pandemic. And that has affected you in Australia. It's affected us here in Canada. It's affected my family back in Scotland. And indeed, it's affected the world. And while that's a health pandemic, if we go to the next slide, what I also want to talk about is the implications for teaching and learning. So of course, health is absolutely essential. And of course, across Australia, there's been difficult decisions made to protect your health. But at the same time, UNESCO forewarned that this could also be a global crisis for teaching and learning. You've been through it. We've been through it too. The rapid response of school closures, move to remote learning, online learning, partial school opening, partial school reopening. And at one point, over 90% of the children around the world were not in school, and over 63 million teachers were being asked to teach, but outside of school. In Canada, as in Australia, different provinces took different decisions. So we've had combinations of in-person learning, remote learning, and hybrid learning. And if we go to the next slide, please. So we have a challenge, and the introduction to today's symposium spoke a little bit about that challenge. The Secretary General of the United Nations has said we're facing a generational catastrophe. The OECD have said the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to generate the greatest disruption in educational opportunity worldwide in a generation. So we have to be really clear on this challenge. What is the challenge that we're facing globally, but also locally, in your classrooms, in your schools, for your students if they're still in remote learning, in their communities and in their homes? What is the challenge that you are facing and your students are facing? But at the same time, the more evidence we gather, the difficult evidence as well as the promising evidence, we also can look at the opportunity. And today's symposium is an opportunity to look forward with faith and with hope and with optimism. So here I am in Toronto broadcasting to you. And there's no doubt that this is bringing us together globally and connecting the global and the local in new ways. And at the heart of the work, as well as health, of course, teaching, learning, equity and well-being, which have always been central, but now they're absolutely crucial. What does this look like now? And again, the continuing importance of the education profession and your work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a paper that I co-authored with some colleagues here in Ontario in the run-up to the start of the new school year here in Ontario. So our schools closed in March. We moved to remote learning. Schools traditionally open for the new school year early in September. And we started to say, well, what might this look like? There's been all sorts of debates that I'm sure you're very, very aware of and you're living in the middle of, about whether this is a time to transform the education system. There are other people who are desperate to get back to normal, whatever back to normal looked like, and there's a real tension. And we said, let's be gentle. Let's be gentle. Let's be gentle with each other. Let's be gentle with the adults that work in education, with the students they serve, you serve, and with the families and communities involved. So we used a phrase that our teachers use here, and you may use too: go slow to go fast. So we know in teaching that you have to start with the foundations, and you have to scaffold, and you have to be explicit, and you have to go slow and build, because if you don't get those foundations right, there's trouble. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk through what became 10 elements of our suggestions for going slow, being gentle. A phased in return, and you have done that too. Not everyone back all at the same time, all in the same day, without having some time to phase in both in-person and online learning in this new context. Clear communication for everybody. There has been so much information, unfortunately some disinformation, that it's really important that there's clear communication. Prioritize mental health. Now, 74% of teachers surveyed in Canada have expressed serious concerns about the health and well-being of their students during the remote learning period. Surveys of children and young people themselves have brought a range of results. Some children enjoyed being at home. They were happier, they were calmer, they enjoyed being able to spend time with their family. But other students experienced increased anxiety and depression. And one of the big findings is that young people are very worried about somebody that they know getting COVID-19. So we have this combination. And we can't ignore that. I'm sure you're not ignoring that. So when we look around the world, we see the importance of psychosocial and mental health support, recognizing that everyone's been through a lot over this pandemic, and recognizing that and how it will affect students' learning and attention and capacity to learn. If we go to the next slide, please. So we also know that there have been inequities in how students have experienced, and indeed all people have experienced, the pandemic. We don't fully know how the period of remote learning has affected students. There's this concept of learning loss, and when we think about learning loss, previous research on learning loss was school closure for things like the summer break, summer holiday, not the type of remote learning during a pandemic. So we don't fully know. But the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, based on evidence of other times when schools have closed, estimated that the gap between the most disadvantaged and the most advantaged students in terms of their educational performance could have widened by 36%. Now, schools weren't fully closed, there was remote learning. But we also know, for example, here in Ontario about research with what happens to students over the summer break, that it's those students who are already struggling with their learning that fall back the most. Back to some of our emerging evidence here in Canada, and I'm sure you have lots of evidence in Australia too, and I have been following. The students that appear to have been most negatively affected during remote learning are students who live in poverty, students with special needs, exceptionalities, both gifted and other forms of special educational needs, and the full range of learning difficulties, and English language learners. So we know that existing inequities have been exacerbated. Here in Toronto, the highest number of COVID cases are with racialised populations and low income populations, and that of course affects the children too. So what to do? So what we know, and I'm sure you know, is we need to really think about where is our students learning at the moment. The use of diagnostic assessment if there are concerns, for example, about special educational needs or other types of needs. The use of formative assessments, observations of students learning in your classroom if they're back in school, conversations with students, student work, artifacts of students learning, quizzes, tests, all sorts of ranges of assessments that you can use. What we know is that one of the most powerful forms of improving student outcomes is the use of timely and specific feedback that can result in tangible changes in how a student goes about their learning. So in Australia, of course, you're all familiar with John Hattie's work, and formative evaluation is one of the most powerful strategies. In the Education Endowment Foundation analysis, they have said that feedback, when done well, can actually increase student learning by 8 months. So 8 months, that's what we need at this moment after periods of school closure and remote learning. Curriculum modification. So back to the idea of scaffolding and support. Particularly, of course, in reading and writing and mathematics in the early years, but in all subject areas, the question becomes whether it's realistic to expect students to learn the entire curriculum in the same way this year when there have been so many disruptions and changes, and thinking about prioritising, making sure that students are strong in the key components, that there's catch up on areas of concern or weakness rather than trying to cover everything. And this of course means differentiated instruction. So what we know is that within a school, the most important factor is teachers and teaching for student outcomes. And we know that within remote learning, the most important thing is quality of teaching. And that involves it being very explicit in your teaching, the scaffolding that I've mentioned several times, and the use of feedback. Thinking about individual instruction when needed, small group instruction, whole class instruction. I know in Australia that several states and some funders have put an emphasis on the use of tutoring, and tutoring can be a high impact strategy. Individual tutoring, paired tutoring, small group tutoring. However, what we also are seeing from the current international evidence that no one strategy on its own is likely sufficient for this year's teaching and learning context. So tutoring, yes, but it's not the only thing. The most important thing is the quality of teaching and learning in your classrooms and in remote learning situations if you're still involved with them. So thinking about that combination of the supports in the day-to-day teaching and learning of students, and then of any additional supports that can be provided, particularly for disadvantaged and struggling students. Next slide, please. And so I've said less about physical health. Obviously, COVID is a disease, but as well as the COVID implications, and this may differ in Australia, what we're seeing here, for example, in Toronto, is that young people are reporting sleeping more, being less physically active, more screen time online, in fact, much more than paediatricians would recommend or advise, and going outside less. Now, of course, when you're in periods of lockdown or school closure, some of these things become more difficult. But we also need to think about the overall physical health of students as they progress and grow and develop. And then the adults, you matter. That's why I started this presentation. And some of you will be doing well and some of you will be struggling. What we know from our surveys here in Canada is that during remote learning, almost half of our teachers reported their own mental health had deteriorated. Feelings of isolation, feeling less connected to their students. Our schools have reopened here in Ontario, but our teachers are struggling with workload and work intensification and work-life balance, and juggling between in-person, online and hybrid learning requirements. And internationally, we're seeing evidence that the education profession is being stretched at the moment. And of course, that's not sustainable. So next slide. So listening to you, to educators and support staff matters. At the start of my presentation, I spoke about how valuing professional knowledge and leadership and judgment and trust and respect matters. In the words of the Atlantic Rim Collaborative ARC, teachers need to be allowed to be the heroes of learning, like our health workers are being the heroes of combating infectious disease. You know best what's best for your students, for your staff, for your school, and for your community. You know best, and we are seeing local innovation like we've never seen before. And that is so important, that you keep leading the way forward in teaching and learning, equity and well-being for our students and supporting each other. And then, of course, childcare. Making sure that there's childcare both for children who are young, but we also need to make sure that older children and young people have safe places to go when they're not in school. And my final, next slide, please. And finally, for those students and staff who may not be in school, for whatever reason, we need to make sure that there is continued high quality access to online and remote learning. The digital divide has become very real over the past few months. And as I said, at the heart of this is, of course, access to resources, devices and internet, but also quality teaching. And what we're seeing is new ways of being able to engage with parents and families to provide feedback. Parents are not teachers, some of you will be both, but ensuring that there's feedback to parents about their students' learning. So these were the elements we spoke about in the gentle return. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of more ideas before we move on to question time. Next slide, please. So leading the learning profession. For those of you who are in formal leadership roles, I've said about how important the learning profession is. How can you lead professional learning? Next slide. This is based on a study that I did in Canada, and then we revised and updated it actually for Wales as they were developing their leadership college. What we know is that school leaders valuing, engaging in, supporting, modelling professional learning matters. So thinking about how you support your own and also your staff's professional learning. What is your vision for professional learning in your school or in your organisation? How are you making sure that these are being built into your plans and your resources and that connect to priorities that are important within your context for your students, for your staff, and for your school improvement plan if you're in a school? Thinking about how you develop individual and collaborative professional learning, both are important. Thinking about how you engage in the professional learning with your staff and community, but also how you engage in your own professional learning. And for those of you who are interested, if we go to the next slide, please. This is the study that this work was based on, and it was funded by Learning Forward, and it's available on the Learning Forward website. But the key things is thinking about what's the content that's needed now. So I've already mentioned some areas where we know that students appear to be struggling at the moment. So gather your evidence on where your students are and where your staff are, what are the priority needs, and how will you develop collaborative, relevant, practical professional learning opportunities over the coming school year. If we go to the next slide, please. And so I'm going to finish with some examples from a teacher learning and leadership project that I've been involved with here in Ontario. If we go to the next slide. And again, the TLLP report is available on the Ontario Teachers Federation website. The resources are there. Next slide. So in the teacher learning and leadership programme, experienced teachers are encouraged to undertake their own professional learning, but in doing so to engage in professional learning, leading that with and for their peers, and to share their learning more widely. The butterfly is the idea of giving you wings to learn and fly and grow. Next slide, please. So what we see is opportunities for teachers to lead their own and peers learning is powerful. We have quantitative data that shows outcomes, measurable outcomes for teachers' knowledge and skills, but also for student learning. It's important to think about what is the real need, for example, in a classroom, the area that's struggling. As you engage in your professional learning or you think about your plan for this year, what is it you don't know, but who might know? But also, what do you know? You're probably very modest and not explicit about your own knowledge. So what do you know that you could share with someone else? And then how can you engage in a process to inquire and to take action and to share? Next slide, please. So I call it deprivatizing practice. Thinking about times when you can engage in conversations and sharing and inquiry with other colleagues. Thinking about times when you can perhaps engage in opening up your classroom door or other ways online of sharing your learning. Sharing resources that you have developed. That's been so important during the pandemic when there's been so much urgency to develop new resources. Thinking about how you share tools and resources with other people. Next slide. And how are you going to share them? Who do you want to share with? How can you collaborate? For example, can you offer a workshop or a professional learning opportunity? Can you co-teach or observe it in another classroom? And increasingly the use of online particularly social media, to share and engage in networks. Next slide. So one example that I want to share with you is from St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Elementary School here in Ontario. And they wanted to integrate technology into their kindergarten programme pre-COVID. So they engaged in professional learning communities within their school and bringing together teachers and early childhood educators to co-develop pedagogical documentation, ways of sharing kindergarten children's learning in online ways to share that learning with parents. Next slide. So they developed e-portfolios, and children would take photos of their own work as well as the teacher providing copies of the work to send home. And we saw through this that children were reflecting on their own work. They were documenting their own work and proud of their success. They were thinking about their learning. And then, of course, that supported that dialogue between the teacher, the student, and their parent or carer. Next slide. One more example, this time a high school, a secondary school example from Monsignor Prima Catholic Secondary School. So there, only 17% of their students were achieving the provincial standard in grade 9 applied math. And they flipped that to become 73%. And what did they do? Well, they did some of the things I've spoken about. They used diagnostics, they differentiated instruction, they collaborated. But the results didn't all improve. And what they discovered was it was about how students felt about math. So they did work around mindsets and attitudes. And through that combination of changing instruction, but also dealing with the thinking and emotional side, that's when they moved from 17% to 73% succeeding in their math. Next slide, please. So, collaborate. One of the things that's happened during this pandemic is actually increased collaboration. And by collaborating, the image of the moon is because sometimes we have to look outside to reflect differently on ourselves and take that learning back. So we are looking globally, but we're making change locally. Next slide. And two final words. Today is the highest number of COVID cases in Toronto, and I'm pleased that in Australia things are going in the opposite direction and you're seeing improvements. Everyone's a bit scared, said the horse, but we're all less scared together. We're all in this together. And my last slide, I want to again thank you on World Teachers' Day. You matter. And my teacher is the star who taught me how to shine. So thank you for continuing to teach people how to shine. And thank you for this opportunity. And I think we have a few minutes left for questions, Jacinta.
Thank you very much for that, Carol, particularly the butterfly and the deprivatisation. I thought they were the two great concepts from what you brought to us today. We have had some questions in. Let me go straight to one from Robert Scanlon because I think it picks up on a couple of the themes you covered as well. Do you have any evidence to suggest that teachers have instinctively tailored the curriculum to what matters most in the remote learning space and have been more specific or targeted in their instructional practice? And I link that to another question, which is what tips can you suggest to help teachers with individualised teaching programs on short notice and in a remote environment as well?
Thank you. So we are seeing curriculum modifications, and I think that's appropriate and understandable. I mean, everyone got thrown into remote learning at short notice, not necessarily with a pre-existing curriculum or instructional program being available online. Now, everyone works in different policy contexts. Some policy contexts have actually changed their curriculum this year to prioritise the catch-up and scaffolding. Some haven't. Some people are still expected to do everything. But I do think when we're in a context of remote learning or returning to school, it's really important to get the foundational pieces, and you as a teacher will know which elements of the curriculum are more essential. We also are seeing evidence about the importance of course, subject knowledge matters. One part of my career was working in literacy and numeracy, so to me, they're equity strategies. You have to be able to read and write and do mathematics at a level of proficiency and beyond. But we're also seeing the importance of skills. So I know in Australia, as here, there's been debates about global competencies or whatever you want to call them. But in remote learning, self-regulation, ways of students managing themselves when there's not necessarily somebody directly observing them, dealing with the problem solving, communication have become essential. So I actually think that hopefully some of the students will have strengthened there. So my short answer is I think we do need to modify curriculum, and I think use your professional judgment within whatever policy boundaries you can manage. On the instructional piece and individualising instruction, so here in Ontario, our government has a preference for synchronous learning, so live, real-time learning online. Actually the evidence doesn't say that whether you're live or asynchronous makes any difference. What matters is the quality of teaching. So again, I don't know the exact rules that you're expected to follow, but yes, differentiate as far as you can to your learners' needs. Sometimes online and live is great, but also think about all the other range of remote learning opportunities that are possible. Books, they sound old-fashioned now, but books, projects. I said about trying to get children outdoors if that's safe to do so. So I think the one thing, I teach online, but at a university level, it does give you the possibility to individualize as it's more work, but it gives you opportunities because you're in direct contact with each learner in a different way. So I would say try and, if it's within your policy context, try and think not about only having whole class instruction, but when there's opportunities for individual students to be learning in different ways and then to come back in small groups. The research on online learning also shows that peer learning can work. So times when students are actually learning together, obviously depending on their ages, is another possibility.
I think that takes us back to the deprivatisation theme you mentioned earlier. Another question is in relation to our experiences with standardised testing. Now in Australia we cancelled this year's NAP plan. Can you comment on the role of standardised testing in school improvement and how we might adapt to missing 1 year as well?
Yeah, well, there's always a range of opinions about standardised testing. I actually led the review of our assessment system in Ontario, so I'm familiar with the people who absolutely think it's the most essential to people who want to abolish it. But around the world, standardised testing has been put on hold this year in most places. And so I do think it gives us an opportunity, whether it's NAPLAN or in my context, a different assessment system, to think about the future of assessment. There are international movements to different forms of assessment that can still provide feedback that's meaningful to students, to their parents, and to their teachers. Without standardised testing, of course, teacher moderation, teacher professional judgment become very important. Opportunities, if you can, to engage in those moderation conversations with colleagues, to think about making sure that there's some consistency in how students are receiving grades. But really, I think in this particular year, as I said, diagnostic and formative assessment are going to be crucial. And because children have been at home, parents are now used to seeing and hearing about learning. So move forward with those. I think the temptation will be to go back to the old standardised system quickly, but I actually think it gives us a moment to pause and to think about, in this context, what alternative possibilities there are. There's interesting work around online types of assessment. So my short answer is I think standardised assessment should be paused this year. I think other assessments are more important, but there is always a need for some system level measures and for some identification of those students who are struggling the most.
Thank you, Carol, and you highlight another one of the opportunities of this pandemic period for that pause. Yeah. Thank you very much again. Can I please welcome my chair, the chair of the National Catholic Education Commission, Senior Business Leader Nicholas Moore, to provide a vote of thanks.